I sprinted into Saint Dorian Medical Center, terrified my husband was dying, but through the hospital room glass, his young secretary held his hand, a little boy beside her crying for his daddy. The true shock wasn't the betrayal itself. That child was the key for his family to steal a trust, an empire, and my future. I did not scream. I stepped back, smiled like the perfect wife, and let every lie sign its own death warrant. My name is Wren Parker. I am 37 years old, a partner at Sterling Vale Advisory, and my entire existence has been engineered around calculating risk and mitigating disaster. Up until 3:17 in the afternoon on a stifling Tuesday, I believed I had absolute control over every variable in my life. I had just walked out of a suffocating glass boardroom in downtown Charlotte, having successfully restructured a failing logistics company. The negotiations had been a high-wire act for 72 straight hours. My shoulders ached, and my mind was running on the fumes of sheer willpower. I was standing in the marble lobby, slipping my phone into my leather trench coat, ready to hail a car and finally go home. Then the screen lit up with an unknown local number. I answered on the second ring. A voice with the detached cadence of an emergency room nurse echoed through the speaker. She asked if I was the emergency contact for the owner of this phone, a Mr. Nolan Mercer. I felt the breath leave my lungs in one violent rush. I told her yes, I am his wife. The nurse informed me that Nolan had been in a severe automobile accident. He was currently stabilizing at Saint Dorian Medical Center, but he had sustained head trauma and multiple lacerations. They needed a family member on site immediately to authorize emergency surgical procedures and sign the release forms. The marble floor beneath my heels felt as though it had turned to ash. I did not ask for the details of the crash. I simply broke into a run. The drive to Saint Dorian Medical Center was a blur of blaring horns, screeching tires, and a heart hammering violently against my ribs. I wove through the heavy mid-afternoon traffic like a woman possessed, running 2 yellow lights and a glaring red. The speedometer needle hovered dangerously high. My mind was a chaotic storm of genuine, suffocating terror. Nolan, my husband of 8 years. The thought of him bleeding on a sterile hospital cot threatened to blind me. Yet, beneath the surge of adrenaline and grief, a strange, cold intuition began to coil in the pit of my stomach. A phantom ache, a microscopic splinter of doubt. Nolan was supposed to be in a closed-door meeting on the opposite side of the city. Why was he driving near the industrial district? I pushed the thought down, blaming my corporate paranoia. I threw my car into a parking space and sprinted through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room. The air inside hit me like a physical wall, a nauseating cocktail of bleach and human despair. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pale glow over the waiting area. I slammed my hands down on the cold laminate of the triage desk. I gasped for air. Struggling to keep my voice steady, I told the receptionist my name. I told her I was here for Nolan Mercer. I told her I needed the paperwork right this second. The receptionist, an older woman with tired eyes, began typing his name into her computer. Her fingers paused. She frowned, squinting at the screen, and then looked up at me with profound confusion. She cleared her throat. She said, "I am sorry, ma'am, but there must be some sort of misunderstanding. The patient's wife and son are already inside with him. The entire world stopped spinning. The ambient noise of the emergency room was sucked into a terrifying vacuum of silence. Wife and son. The words did not compute. They hit the analytical center of my brain and shattered into meaningless syllables. Nolan and I did not have children. We had spent the last 3 years navigating the silent grief of failed fertility treatments. There was no son, and I was the only legal wife Nolan Mercer had possessed for the last 8 years. A freezing numbness began at the base of my spine and rapidly spread through my veins, instantly neutralizing the frantic panic that had driven me here. The terrified wife who had raced through traffic died right there at the triage desk. In her place, the ruthless restructuring partner awoke. I did not argue with the nurse. I simply asked her for his room number in a voice so devoid of emotion it made her blink in surprise. Room 214. I turned on my heel and walked down the corridor. My breathing was perfectly, mechanically measured. I reached the heavy door of room 214. I did not push the handle. Instead, I stepped to the side and peered through the narrow, rectangular observation glass embedded in the door. Nolan was lying on the elevated hospital bed. His head was wrapped in white gauze, a dark stain blossoming near his temple. His left arm was immobilized in a sling. He was alive, he was conscious, and he was holding someone else's hand. Sitting on the edge of his mattress, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs, was Ava Bell, his 24-year-old executive secretary. But it was not Ava's presence that felt like a physical knife twisting in my gut. It was the little boy clinging to her waist. He looked to be about 5 years old. He was burying his face into Ava's side, trembling violently, and then, through the heavy door, I saw his lips form the word. I could not hear it, but I could read the shape of it perfectly. Daddy. The boy looked at my husband, reached out his tiny hand, and mouthed the word again. Daddy. And Nolan, my husband, reached out his bruised hand and gently stroked the boy's hair. The sheer gravity of the betrayal threatened to crack my ribs, but the true, paralyzing shock came a second later. Standing just behind Ava, forming a protective semicircle around the bed, were Evelyn and Grant Mercer, my mother-in-law and father-in-law. Evelyn was gently rubbing Ava's back, leaning down to whisper something soothing into the young woman's ear. Grant stood tall, his hand resting firmly on the edge of the boy's chair. They looked like a family. A complete, terrified, but deeply bonded family. And I was the ghost haunting the hallway. Any ordinary woman would have thrown that door open. Any ordinary wife would have marched into that sterile room, demanded answers, screamed until her throat bled, and torn that pathetic illusion to shreds. She would have shattered the fragile peace of the trauma ward. I am not an ordinary woman. I do not react. I calculate. I stared through that glass for exactly 10 more seconds. I cataloged every detail. The familiar way Evelyn touched Ava, the lack of surprise in Grant's posture, the sheer domestic intimacy of the lie. This was not a fleeting affair. This was an established, fully funded, parallel existence, and Nolan's parents were not just aware of it, they were active participants. I stepped back from the glass. The air in my lungs felt like liquid nitrogen. I turned my back to room 214 and walked down the hallway. I pushed open the heavy steel door to the emergency fire escape stairwell. The door clicked shut behind me, sealing me in a cavern of concrete and cold echoes. I leaned against the cinder block wall. I did not shed a single tear. The headache that had been brewing since the boardroom in Charlotte suddenly tightened around my skull like an iron vise, compressing every scattered emotion into a singular razor-sharp point of clarity. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number I knew better than my own. Mara Keene answered on the first ring. Mara was my chief data analyst, my right hand at the firm, and the most brutally efficient human being I had ever met. "Ren," she said, her voice crisp. "Did you close the logistics deal?" "The deal is done," I replied. My voice was completely flat. "Mara, I need you to execute a priority lockdown protocol immediately." There was a split second of silence on the line. "Who is the target?" "Nolan," I said. "I want his entire digital footprint frozen and duplicated by midnight. Access the cloud backups for both his personal and corporate accounts. I want real-time location data pinged from his car's GPS spanning the last 36 months. Override the passwords on his company devices and mirror his work calendars. I want every deleted email, every hidden transaction, every encrypted message, and every redacted meeting schedule dumped into a secure server before the sun comes up." "Understood," Mara said, not asking a single question. "What is the authorization code?" I closed my eyes, listening to the faint wail of an ambulance siren outside. Total liquidation. I said. I hung up the phone. I stood alone in the concrete stairwell, listening to the rhythmic beat of my own heart. The terrified wife was dead. The mourning widow never got the chance to exist. Now, there was only the architect of their ruin. I inhaled the stagnant stairwell air. One deep breath to steady the violent tremors in my hands. A second breath to lock the ruthless restructuring partner back inside my ribs and resurrect the devoted, terrified wife. By the third breath, my eyes were sufficiently glassy, my lips parted in a perfectly constructed portrait of shock and profound relief. I smoothed the lapels of my trench coat. I pushed the heavy stairwell door open and walked back toward room 214. I did not knock. I pushed the door open with a frantic, desperate energy. The temperature in the room plummeted the exact second my heels clicked against the linoleum floor. The domestic tableau I had witnessed through the glass shattered into a million jagged pieces. Ava flinched, instinctively pulling the little boy behind her legs as if I were a predator entering the den. Grant cleared his throat aggressively, suddenly finding the acoustic ceiling tiles fascinating. But Evelyn, the Mercer family matriarch, recovered with the terrifying, practiced speed of a seasoned socialite. "Wren, darling." Evelyn cooed, gliding across the cramped room to intercept me. Her voice was spun sugar laced with arsenic. She placed her heavily manicured hands on my shoulders, attempting to physically block my path to the hospital bed. "We did not expect you so soon. The nurse said you were tied up with your clients in Charlotte. You poor thing. You look absolutely drained. Please, go back to the penthouse and rest. The family has everything perfectly under control here." I offered Evelyn a brittle, fragile smile. I could not possibly rest. "Evelyn," I whispered, making sure my voice trembled. "Not until I see him." I sidestepped her with a smooth, fluid grace, leaving her hands grasping at empty air. I rushed to the side of the hospital bed. Nolan looked pathetic. The mild concussion had left his pupils sluggish, and the intravenous painkillers were making his movements heavy and uncoordinated. I reached out and took his uninjured right hand. His fingers were cold. I laced my fingers through his, fighting the violent, primal urge to snap his wrist backward. "Nolan," I breathed, letting my voice crack at precisely the right frequency. "Thank God. When the emergency room called, I thought I had lost you." He blinked up at me, his gaze shifting nervously over my shoulder toward Ava and the little boy, then darting back to my face. He was searching for any sign of recognition, any hint of fury or accusation, finding only a tearful, doting wife. The tension visibly drained from his rigid shoulders. He squeezed my hand, letting out a long, shaky exhale. "I am okay. Wren," he rasped. "It looks much worse than it actually is. Just a bad scrape and a headache." He was weak, disoriented, and entirely off his guard. It was the perfect vulnerability. I brushed a stray lock of hair away from his bandaged forehead, playing the role of the tender caretaker to perfection. As I leaned over him, murmuring soothing reassurances, my eyes swept the room with the brutal efficiency of a forensic auditor. I cataloged the items scattered on the small beige side table. Beside a plastic pitcher of ice water sat a navy blue canvas tote bag. Poking out of the front pocket was a brightly colored pediatric health insurance card. Next to the bag rested a thick manila envelope bearing the embossed gold seal of Vance and Sterling Estate Law. And right beside that envelope was a leather-bound planner, left wide open, my vision locked onto the exposed page. The handwriting was neat and looping. The upcoming weekend was blocked out in thick red ink, labeled with a single damning phrase, "Charleston Villa-Estate Hearing Prep." I slowly straightened my posture and turned my head, allowing my gaze to finally fall upon the young woman and the child cowering near the window. I tilted my head, adopting an expression of polite, mild confusion. "I am so sorry. My mind is completely scrambled today," I said softly, looking directly into Ava's terrified eyes. "I do not think we have been formally introduced. And who are these sweet faces?" The air in the room grew instantly thick, suffocating and tense. Ava opened her mouth, her face completely drained of color, but Evelyn swooped in before a single syllable could escape the secretary's trembling lips. "Oh, these are just distant cousins." "Wren," Evelyn declared, her voice unnaturally loud and fiercely cheerful, "on Grant's side of the family." They were passing through the city on a road trip and rushed over to help when they heard the awful news. So incredibly kind of them to drop by in our hour of need. I looked at the little boy. He bore absolutely no physical resemblance to the Mercer bloodline, yet mere minutes ago he had called my husband his father. I looked back at Evelyn, offering a serene, entirely unquestioning nod. "How wonderfully kind," I murmured, my tone practically dripping with manufactured gratitude. I did not push the issue. I did not demand names or interrogate their lineage. A cornered rat will bite and fight for its life, but a rat that believes it has successfully escaped the trap will happily walk straight into the incinerator. I wanted them comfortable. I wanted them to believe their pathetic illusion was bulletproof. A nurse briskly walked into the room carrying a thick plastic clipboard. "Excuse me," she announced, scanning the room. "I need the primary emergency contact to sign off on the admission protocols and collect the patient's personal effects." Evelyn took a half step forward, her hand reaching out for the pen. I smoothly cut across her path, intercepting the nurse before Evelyn could close the distance. "I am his legal wife," I stated clearly. My tone was pleasant, conversational even, but it carried the unmistakable weight of absolute legal authority. "I will handle all of the paperwork." Evelyn froze, her jaw tightening, but she could not protest without raising suspicion. I took the clipboard from the nurse. I methodically signed my name on exactly 14 different lines, legally cementing myself as the sole gatekeeper for his medical records, his discharge status, and his billing information. The nurse then handed me a clear plastic bag containing Nolan's leather wallet, his car keys, and his shattered company smartphone. I dropped the bag directly into my designer tote, securing the physical evidence. I turned back to the hospital bed, my expression shifting back to deep concern. "Nolan, sweetheart," I said softly. "The board of directors at Northline Aerial Systems is going to panic the second the news of this automobile crash hits the corporate wire. The stock could take a massive hit if they suspect there is a leadership vacuum. You need to focus entirely on resting and healing for the next 48 hours. I reached into my leather briefcase. As a corporate restructuring partner, I never traveled without a blank crisis management folio. I pulled out a standard emergency operational maintenance proxy form and an expensive fountain pen. "I can step in and manage the corporate noise for you," I offered smoothly. "Just sign this document. It temporarily delegates emergency operational oversight to me so I can keep the wolves at bay and the board members calm while you recover." Nolan hesitated for a fraction of a second, but his head was throbbing, his overbearing mother was hovering anxiously, and his secret family was standing merely 3 feet away, a constant source of stress. I was offering him a golden parachute out of his immediate corporate responsibilities. Furthermore, he knew my professional reputation flawlessly. I fixed broken, bleeding companies for a living. To him, I was just doing what I always did. I was managing the crisis. He took the heavy pen from my hand. He barely skimmed the legal header before scrawling his sloppy signature at the bottom of the page. He handed the paper back to me. He had absolutely no idea what he had just done. By signing that single, innocuous-looking sheet of paper, my husband had just granted me unrestricted, legally binding access to every single corporate ledger, every hidden offshore account, and every encrypted work email within Northline Aerial Systems. He had handed me the keys to his kingdom while smiling at me. I slipped the signed document back into my briefcase, ensuring the clasp snapped shut with a satisfying click. I leaned down and pressed a gentle, lingering kiss to his bruised cheek. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the sterile hospital iodine made my stomach turn, but my smile never faltered. "Get some sleep, my love," I whispered against his skin. "I will take care of everything." My fingers hovered over the keyboard. The marble floors of my penthouse were freezing against my bare feet. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. My dining room, usually reserved for polite corporate dinners, had been transformed into a digital war room. 3 high-powered laptops hummed on the mahogany table, their screens casting a harsh blue light across the room. Mara sat across from me, her fingers flying across her keys with the speed and precision of a concert pianist. 2 of my most trusted forensic accountants from Sterling Vale Advisory were patched in via a secure, Encrypted audio link. Thanks to the emergency operational maintenance proxy Nolan had so willingly signed hours earlier, we possessed a skeleton key to the entirety of Northline aerial systems. We were bypassing the firewalls of his private servers and tearing through the encrypted financial ledgers of the company. It did not take long for the first landmine to detonate. Mara stopped typing. The silence in the room was deafening. She turned her laptop screen toward me. "Look at the discretionary expense accounts categorized under executive wellness and retention," Mara instructed, her voice devoid of any inflection. I leaned forward. My eyes scanned the spreadsheets. Row after row of massive, recurring wire transfers were neatly documented. They were not paying for corporate retreats or premium health club memberships. Northline Aerial Systems was actively funding a secret life. There was a monthly debit of $12,000 for a luxury townhouse rental in the exclusive Dilworth neighborhood. There was a $50,000 annual tuition payment to the Hawthorne Day School. There were premium pediatric health insurance premiums, and a lease agreement for a top-tier imported sport utility vehicle. Every single one of these assets and services was registered under the name Ava Bell. But my husband was not foolish enough to wire the money directly from his corporate accounts to his secretary. He knew standard internal audits would flag direct payments to a subordinate. "Follow the routing numbers," I told Mara, tracing the line of data with my index finger. "Where does the money wash before it hits her?" Mara's fingers danced across the keys. A new window populated on the screen. The funds were being funneled through a third-party shell corporation registered as a private philanthropic consulting firm. I did not need Mara to run a deep background check on the board of directors for that shell company. I already knew who controlled it. The Mercer family office. The realization settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Evelyn and Grant Mercer were not merely covering up their son's infidelity out of some twisted sense of maternal and paternal loyalty. They were the architects of the financial infrastructure sustaining it. The entire Mercer family was complicit in laundering corporate funds to maintain this fabricated parallel domesticity, but why? The question pounded against my temples. Evelyn Mercer despised the lower classes. She would never accept a 24-year-old administrative assistant into her elite social circle without a profoundly lucrative reason. I opened the leather briefcase resting by my feet. I pulled out the mental image I had captured in the hospital room, the manila envelope with the gold seal from Vance and Sterling Estate Law, the leather planner explicitly mentioning an estate hearing prep in Charleston. "Mara," I commanded, my voice dropping an octave, "cross-reference Nolan's personal encrypted emails with any correspondence from Vance and Sterling Estate Law. Search for the keyword trust or legacy." It took exactly 4 minutes to unearth the Holy Grail. Nolan had been careless. He had forwarded a draft of a highly confidential legal addendum to his personal server so he could read it on his tablet. I opened the document file. It was an amendment to the Mercer Legacy Trust, a massive, multi-generational financial vehicle established by Nolan's grandfather, Harlan Mercer. Harlan was 92 years old and currently rotting away in a private hospice care facility, his organs failing one by one. I read the heavily redacted legalese, translating the dense jargon into plain, ruthless truth. The trust held the controlling shares to the entire Mercer family empire, a portfolio worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The latest amendment, drafted mere months ago as Harlan's health plummeted, contained an ironclad, archaic stipulation. In order for the controlling shares of the trust to unlock and transfer to Nolan upon Harlan's death, Nolan had to publicly present a confirmed biological male heir under the age of 10. If he failed to produce a son before the old man took his final breath, the bulk of the estate would bypass the immediate family and dissolve into a series of charitable foundations and minor cousin holdings. I stared at the glowing screen. The air in the penthouse felt dangerously thin. Ava and that little boy were not a second family born out of misplaced passion. They were a multi-million-dollar theatrical performance. That terrified, trembling 5-year-old child was not the tragic result of a broken marriage. He was a lockpick. He was the golden key the Mercer family desperately needed to shove into the ignition of the Mercer Legacy Trust before Harlan died. My husband was staging a fraudulent succession plan. Are you seeing this? Mara whispered over the audio link. Even her iron composure was fracturing. I am seeing it, I replied, my tone dangerously calm. But something is missing. Northline Aerial Systems has been bleeding cash for 3 quarters. The company is over-leveraged. Nolan could not afford to sustain the corporate bribes, his own lavish lifestyle, and a shadow family in a luxury townhouse without tripping a massive liquidity crisis. Where did the bridge capital come from? Who has been floating the cash flow for the last 9 months while they wait for the old man to die? I took control of the keyboard. I began running a forensic trace on the capital injection accounts that had artificially propped up Northline's balance sheet since last autumn. I followed the digital breadcrumbs backward, moving from the corporate ledgers, through a labyrinth of holding accounts, straight into a private banking sector. The screen flashed, rendering a scanned image of a commercial mortgage agreement. My breath caught in my throat. It was a loan document for $2.5 million. The collateral securing the loan was a massive, pristine tract of ranch land in the state of Montana. It was property my late father had left entirely to me. It was my private heritage, legally shielded from my marriage by a bulletproof prenuptial agreement. I scrolled down to the signature line at the bottom of the digital parchment. There, staring back at me in blue ink, was my name. Wren Parker. But I had never signed that document. I leaned closer to the monitor, analyzing the loops and angles of the cursive script. It was an exceptionally good imitation. It mimicked the sharp slant of my letters perfectly. But the pressure points were wrong. The hesitation in the cross of the letter T was completely foreign. Nolan had forged my signature. He had secretly mortgaged my deceased father's land, stolen $2.5 million of my private equity, and quietly injected it into the gaping holes of his failing company to keep the lights on and to pay for Ava's extravagant silence. I sat back in my chair. The headache was gone. In its place was a crystalline, terrifying sense of purpose. I was not a woman dealing with a cheating spouse. I was the central victim of a sprawling, multi-layered criminal enterprise. My husband, my mother-in-law, and my father-in-law had conspired to commit estate fraud against a dying patriarch. They had orchestrated severe corporate embezzlement against Northline Aerial Systems, and they had executed felony identity theft and property fraud against me. This was no longer a matter of filing for a contentious divorce and fighting over the division of the silver flatware. This was a racket. They had built a house of cards on the foundation of my stolen wealth and my perceived ignorance. Wren? Mara asked tentatively through the speaker. What do we do? Do I contact the federal authorities? I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. The skyline of Charlotte was sleeping, completely unaware of the absolute destruction I was about to unleash. No, I answered quietly. We do not call the authorities. If we blow the whistle now, the federal regulators will freeze everything. The company goes into receivership. The trust gets locked in probate court for a decade, and the Mercers might just negotiate a plea deal. That is entirely too clean. They would survive. I closed the forged mortgage document. We let them think they are winning. I told my team. We let Harlan Mercer die. We let them walk right up to the finish line, completely convinced they have secured the empire. We do not stop the machinery. Mara, we just quietly change the locks on the doors while they are inside. I reached for my cold cup of coffee. The blade was completely out of its sheath now, and I knew exactly where to make the first cut. The morning sun crested over the Charlotte skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the asphalt. I stood in my walk-in closet, my fingers brushing against silk and wool, calculating my armor for the day. I bypassed the commanding charcoal pinstripes and the severe navy blazers. Instead, I selected a tailored suit in a soft, understated shade of dove gray. It was an outfit that projected competence, absolute stability, and most importantly, a complete lack of predatory intent. It was the uniform of the endlessly dependable wife, the woman who existed solely to absorb the collateral damage of her husband's chaotic life. I arrived at Saint Dorian Medical Center at exactly 8 in the morning. The trauma ward had lost the frenetic, terrifying energy of the previous afternoon. Settling into the dull, sterile routine of morning rounds, I stepped into room 214. The air felt heavy, laced with the smell of strong coffee and floral antiseptic. Nolan was propped up against a mountain of pillows. The swelling around his temple had darkened to a deep, bruised violet, and he looked smaller than he had the day before. The secret family was mercifully absent, likely banished to their luxury townhouse by Evelyn before official visiting hours commenced. Only Evelyn remained, sitting rigidly in the corner armchair, guarding her son like a prized, fragile investment. I approached the bed, my expression a carefully curated mask of urgent, loving concern. I leaned in close, resting my hand gently over his uninjured forearm. "Nolan," I whispered, keeping my voice low and tight, carrying the perfect frequency of corporate panic. "We have a severe problem." His eyes snapped to mine, the heavy fog of the painkillers instantly burning off. "What is it?" he rasped, struggling to sit up straighter. "The news of your crash leaked to the financial press sometime around 4 o'clock this morning." I lied seamlessly. "The board of directors at Northline is practically rioting. The lenders are spooked. Harrow Ridge Capital called me twice before sunrise. They are threatening to freeze the revolving credit lines and trigger a default covenant if they do not receive immediate ironclad assurances regarding the operational stability of the firm." I watched the color drain entirely from his face. Harrow Ridge Capital was his primary lifeline. Without their capital, Northline Aerial Systems would not survive a fortnight. He was already drowning in his own embezzlement, and the threat of an external financial freeze terrified him. I opened my leather briefcase and retrieved a sleek black folio. I laid it on the edge of his mattress and opened it, revealing 3 distinct stacks of legal documents. I spent the entire night doing damage control. I continued, my voice smooth and deeply reassuring. "I can build a firewall around the company and keep the lenders at bay, but I cannot hold the dam much longer without formal, legally binding authorization. I need you to sign these. Nolan, right now." I tapped the first stack. "This is a temporary voting proxy. It grants me the authority to vote your shares at the emergency board meeting this afternoon, ensuring the vultures do not try to vote you out of your chair while you are lying in a hospital bed." He nodded quickly, his ego blinding him to the transfer of power. He reached for the pen I offered. I moved my finger to the second document. "This is a consent decree for an expedited, independent audit. Harrow Ridge is demanding absolute transparency before they release the next tranche of funding. They need to know the books are clean." Nolan froze. The pen hovered an inch above the paper. His eyes darted frantically around the room, finally landing on my face. "An audit," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Ren, the books are incredibly complicated right now. We cannot let an external firm tear through the ledgers, not yet." I leaned closer, invading his personal space, wrapping him in the illusion of my unwavering loyalty. "I know they are complicated." "Nolan," I murmured, "I know there are things buried in those accounts, but if you do not sign this, they will force a hostile takeover by noon tomorrow. Let me be the one to manage the auditors. Let me clean up the mess." "I always clean up the mess. Do I not?" He stared into my eyes, searching for a trap and finding nothing but the devoted woman who had saved him a dozen times before. With a trembling hand, he signed the consent decree. I did not give him time to breathe. I slid the final document squarely in front of him, and this is a standard certification of internal related party disclosures. It is a legal formality stating that all executive transactions have been conducted above board. Once you sign this, I can lock the file and shield it from the primary audit sweep. It was the ultimate poison pill. By signing the certification, he was legally perjuring himself, cementing his financial crimes in federal ink. He hesitated again, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. I needed him to verbalize the fraud. Before walking into the hospital, I had activated the voice memo application on my cellular phone, which currently sat in the breast pocket of my suit jacket, capturing every single syllable spoken in the room. "Nolan," I said, softening my tone to a gentle, pleading whisper. I saw some glaring irregularities in the bridge capital transfers last night. Massive cash bleed. I am not angry, but you have to tell me what I am walking into so I can bury it before the lenders see it. Why were those funds diverted from the primary accounts? He looked away, staring blankly at the sterile white wall. The shame and the pressure were breaking him. He swallowed hard. I had to do it. Ren, he muttered, his voice brittle and weak. Things got entirely out of hand. I hid some expenses to keep the family peace. You have to understand, it was just to keep things stable until the legacy trust resolved itself. My heart beat a steady, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. I hid some expenses to keep the family peace. The confession was vague, but paired with the forensic evidence my team was compiling, it was a lethal weapon. Just sign the paper, sweetheart, I said softly. I will handle the rest. He signed the final page. I neatly gathered the documents, placing them back into the black folio. I snapped the briefcase shut. Evelyn, who had been watching the exchange with silent, hawkish intensity, finally stood up. She walked toward me, her designer heels clicking sharply against the floor. She placed a hand on my arm, her grip entirely too tight. She guided me away from the bed, forcing me into a secluded corner of the room. You work so incredibly hard for this family. Ren, Evelyn said. Her voice was dripping with a sweet, condescending poison. You are a brilliant manager of crises. It truly is a shame that you and Nolan could never build a true, lasting home together, but a lineage needs a true heir. After all, a legacy simply cannot be handed to strangers. The words were a calculated strike, designed to remind me of my barrenness and my status as an outsider. It was her indirect confirmation that I was merely a temporary placeholder, a useful tool to be discarded the moment the real heir was secured. Any other woman would have shattered. She would have slapped Evelyn across the face or screamed the truth into the sterile air. I did absolutely nothing. I looked directly into Evelyn Mercer's cold, calculating eyes. I committed the precise shade of her arrogance to memory. I looked past her to my husband, who was leaning back against his pillows, already believing he had survived the storm. I did not react because my wrath was no longer a wild, uncontrollable fire. It was a perfectly engineered machine. I wanted them to feel secure. I wanted them to continue marching forward, completely convinced that they still controlled the narrative, that the massive fortune of the Mercer Legacy Trust was waiting for them just over the horizon. We all have our designated roles to play. Evelyn, I replied, my voice completely devoid of friction. I will see you both later. I turned and walked out of room 214. I strode down the brightly lit hospital corridor, the heavy briefcase swinging rhythmically at my side. I possessed temporary legal control over Northline aerial systems. I held unrestricted access to their financial ledgers. And I carried a recorded confession in my pocket. I had decided not to destroy anyone today. The most greedy, ravenous prey will always walk willingly into the slaughterhouse, provided you convince them the prize is waiting on the killing floor. The digital extraction was nearly complete by the time the afternoon sun began to dip behind the Charlotte skyline. I sat at my mahogany dining table, staring at the high-resolution monitor. The emergency operational proxy had successfully bypassed the final layer of encryption on Nolan's private executive cloud. I was no longer just looking at corporate ledgers or shell company transfers. I was deep inside the architecture of his lies. Mara sat across from me, her eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion but burning with analytical intensity. She pushed a freshly decrypted folder across the secure network to my screen. It was labeled simply with a single letter, J. I double-clicked the icon. The folder blossomed into a mosaic of scanned documents, medical histories, and digital photographs. This was the operational dossier for the child, Jude. I opened the first document, expecting to find a falsified paternity test or a discreet birth certificate bearing my husband's name. Instead, I found a legally binding decree of guardianship from a county family court. I zoomed in on the scanned parchment. The biological mother was listed as Chloe Bell. The biological father was listed as Staff Sergeant Michael Hayes. There was a thick black stamp across both of their names. Deceased. I felt the air evacuate my lungs. I read the following paragraphs with a terrifying, absolute clarity. Chloe Bell was Ava's older sister. She had died in a tragic vehicle collision 3 years ago. The boy's father, a military serviceman, had perished in a combat deployment shortly after the child was born. Ava Bell was not the mother of a billionaire's illegitimate son. She was merely the court-appointed legal guardian of her orphaned nephew. Nolan was not the father. He did not share a single microscopic sequence of genetic material with the boy who had called him daddy in that sterile hospital room. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the deception hit me like a physical blow. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing through the implications. The Mercer Legacy Trust explicitly demanded a confirmed biological male heir under the age of 10. Nolan knew he was sterile. The fertility clinics had confirmed it during our agonizing years of trying to conceive, though he had sworn me to absolute secrecy out of sheer masculine pride. But he had not just deceived his dying grandfather. He had completely manipulated his own parents. Evelyn and Grant Mercer were snobs of the highest order. They would never, under any circumstances, embrace a working-class secretary and another man's orphaned child. They were funding the luxury townhouse, the elite private school tuition, and the imported vehicle through their philanthropic shell company for one reason only. Nolan had convinced them that Jude was his biological son. He had sold them the lie that this illicit child was the sole salvation of their massive family fortune. The entire Mercer family was marching toward a federal fraud charge, and Evelyn and Grant were gleefully funding their own destruction, completely blind to the fact that the golden heir was a biological stranger. How did he sustain the illusion? I asked the empty room, my voice a sharp whisper. Mara's fingers flew across her keyboard. "Look at the administrative metadata," she replied. I opened the pediatric health insurance card, the exact same one I had spotted poking out of Ava's canvas tote bag in the trauma ward. It was a supplementary, private policy purchased entirely in cash. It was designed to aggressively mask the primary state-funded orphan benefits Jude actually received. I opened the enrollment forms for the Hawthorne Day School. Nolan was listed merely as an emergency contact and a financial sponsor, exploiting a vague administrative loophole that allowed him to pay the $50,000 annual tuition without ever legally declaring paternity under penalty of perjury. Then, I opened the digital photographs. There were dozens of them. Nolan, Ava, and Jude at a pumpkin patch. Nolan carrying Jude on his shoulders at a private beach. They were meticulously staged. But when I checked the digital timestamps and the geolocation tags, the truth unraveled. They were snapped during the brief, stolen hours when Nolan claimed to be playing golf with board members. They were carefully curated pieces of propaganda, designed to be discreetly shown to Evelyn and Grant as proof of his paternal devotion, building the illusion of a robust, hidden family unit. But what about Ava? The question gnawed at my strategic logic. Why would a young, seemingly terrified woman participate in a multi-million-dollar estate fraud? I ordered Mara to run a targeted sweep of his encrypted text messages, filtering for conversations between Nolan and his secretary. The extracted chat logs painted a pathetic, deeply disturbing picture. Ava Bell possessed absolutely no comprehension of the Mercer Legacy Trust or the financial mechanics of the shell company. Nolan had spun a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. He had convinced the grieving, overwhelmed young woman that his marriage to me was a hollow, loveless corporate arrangement. He promised her that he was simply waiting for the right moment to finalize a divorce. He swore that once he was free, he would legally adopt Jude, marry her, and elevate both of them into the legitimate Mercer dynasty. He taught the traumatized little boy to call him by a father's title, anchoring the child's fragile psychology to a phantom promise. Ava genuinely believed she was the tragic, noble heroine of a sweeping romance. She thought she was building a family. She had no idea she was merely harboring a lockpick for a trust fund. The final, lethal piece of evidence emerged from a deeply buried, recently deleted subfolder. Mara's forensic software reconstructed a corrupted file, It was a legal document drafted by a third-tier discount law firm entirely disconnected from the Mercer family's usual legal counsel. The title of the document read, Post-Resolution Non-Disclosure and Severance Agreement. I opened the file. The legal language was brutal, draconian, and utterly devoid of humanity. It outlined a scenario strictly contingent upon the successful transfer and unsealing of the Mercer Legacy Trust. According to the drafted terms, upon the release of the inheritance, Ava Bell was to receive a single, lump sum payment of exactly $250,000. In exchange for this meager payout, she was legally required to immediately resign from Northline Aerial Systems. She was mandated to relocate her primary residence to a location no less than 500 miles outside the city limits of Charlotte. She was strictly forbidden from contacting Nolan, Evelyn, Grant, or any entity associated with the Mercer family ever again. If she violated the gag order, the agreement stipulated crippling financial penalties that would bankrupt her for the rest of her natural life. The text blurred in front of my eyes as the absolute, freezing cruelty of his plan crystallized. Nolan never intended to divorce me. A divorce would trigger the audit clauses in our prenuptial agreement and expose his massive embezzlement of corporate funds and my stolen Montana real estate equity. He never intended to marry Ava. He certainly never intended to adopt a traumatized orphan. He was going to use them to unlock the trust, claim the empire, and then he was going to throw the secretary and the little boy into the gutter with a gag order and a fraction of a % of the total fortune. He was going to walk away clean, the undisputed king of the Mercer dynasty, leaving a trail of destroyed lives in his wake. I closed the drafted agreement. The rhythmic humming of the computer processors was the only sound in the penthouse. The entire geometry of the battlefield had just shifted beneath my feet. Hours ago, I had viewed Ava Bell as a parasite, a willing accomplice who had invaded my marriage and helped pillage my assets. I had fully intended to crush her alongside the rest of the Mercer family. But the truth was vastly more potent. Ava was not the enemy general. She was a lamb tethered to a stake, blissfully unaware of the butcher standing directly behind her. She was the most fragile, combustible element in Nolan's entire elaborate machine. If I destroyed her now, if I exposed the truth to Evelyn and Grant prematurely, I would merely be doing Nolan's dirty work. I would be removing his loose ends. I stood up from the mahogany table. I walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the glittering streetlights of the city far below. A cold, magnificent calm washed over my entire body. I would not attack Ava Bell. I would not humiliate her or threaten her with legal ruin. Instead, I would sit down with her. I would carefully, methodically strip away the romantic illusion my husband had built around her. I would hand her the blueprint of her own execution, and then I would hand her a match. Nolan believed his secret was locked away in encrypted vaults and hidden behind a wall of arrogant confidence. He believed he controlled all the pieces on the board. He was about to learn that the most dangerous weapon in a war is not the enemy standing in front of you. It is the loyal soldier standing at your back who suddenly realizes she has been handed a shovel to dig her own grave. The air inside the botanical conservatory was thick and heavy, smelling intensely of damp earth and crushed fern leaves. I chose this specific location with absolute deliberate intent. It was a sprawling glass greenhouse situated 20 miles outside the city limits, a place where the atmosphere was far too humid and the black coffee far too bitter for anyone occupying the Mercer family social circle. It was the perfect, isolated neutral ground for a quiet demolition. I sat at a rusted wrought iron table hidden entirely behind a dense, towering wall of blooming orchids. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Ava Bell walked through the arched glass entrance doors. She looked entirely different outside the sterile confines of the trauma ward, stripped of the protective shadow cast by Evelyn and Grant. She was just a 24-year-old girl drowning in an oversized trench coat, her posture rigid with sheer terror. She scanned the cafe area, her eyes darting like a trapped bird, until she spotted me waiting in the secluded corner. She approached the table as if walking toward a firing squad. She sat down on the edge of the metal chair, clutching her leather purse to her chest like a physical shield. Her jaw was set tightly, bracing herself for the inevitable screaming match, the vicious insults, or the threat of an immediate lawsuit. She was prepared to defend her twisted fairy tale. I did not raise my voice. I did not glare at her. I simply took a slow sip of my herbal tea and set the porcelain cup down on the saucer with a quiet clink. "I am not here to yell at you, Ava," I stated softly, keeping my tone as even and measured as a metronome. "I am here to show you the architectural blueprints of the building you are currently standing in, because it is actively burning to the ground, and you are completely unaware of the smoke." I reached into my leather tote bag and withdrew a single, unmarked manila folder. I placed it squarely in the center of the iron table and pushed it across the glass surface until it rested inches from her tightly clenched hands. "Open it," I commanded. She hesitated, her breathing shallow and rapid. Slowly, she released her grip on her purse and reached for the cover. Flipping it back, the top document was the corporate lease agreement for the luxury townhouse in Dilworth. I watched her eyes scan the highlighted sections. "You believe Nolan rented that property for you," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You believe it is your home. Look at the signatory line. Ava. It is owned by a shell corporation controlled entirely by Evelyn and Grant Mercer. Your name is nowhere on the deed or the binding lease. You are legally classified as a transient guest. They can change the locks and throw your belongings onto the pavement with 0 hours of legal notice." Ava swallowed hard, a flicker of genuine confusion breaking through her defensive armor. She flipped to the next page. It was the tuition payment ledger for the Hawthorne Day School. "The tuition for Jude is paid on a rolling, month-to-month corporate expense account," I continued relentlessly. "It is not an endowed fund. It is not a secured trust. The second Nolan decides you are no longer useful, that payment stops, and your nephew is expelled from that academy the very next morning. I am not a fool," Ava whispered, her voice trembling but defiant. "I know he's using company money right now, but that is only temporary. He told me the plan. Once his grandfather passes away and the estate settles, he is filing for divorce. He is going to adopt Jude legally." I felt a sharp, cold pang of pity beneath my ribs. It was a microscopic sensation, instantly crushed by the tactical necessity of the moment. I reached across the table and turned to the final 2 documents in the folder. "Read the email on the left," I instructed. It was a printed correspondence between Nolan and an offshore wealth manager. Ava leaned down, her eyes tracking across the text. I watched the exact second her heart stopped. She read the sentence where the wealth manager asked about the liability of the child and the mother. She read Nolan's typed response. "They are strictly temporary maintenance expenses. The boy is just the key to unlocking the old man's vault. Nothing more." Ava gasped, a sharp, choked sound that echoed against the glass walls of the greenhouse. Her hands began to shake violently, but I was not finished. I tapped the final document on the right, and this, I said, my voice dropping to a surgical whisper, "is the post-resolution non-disclosure and severance agreement his discount lawyers drafted 3 weeks ago. Read the terms, Ava. $250,000. That is your entire payout. In exchange, you resign from your job, you relocate 500 miles away from Charlotte, and you sign a legally binding gag order forbidding you from ever speaking his name again." Ava stared at the pages. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin the shade of wet ash. The grand, sweeping romance she thought she was living shattered into 1,000 dirty, pathetic shards of corporate fraud. She was not the future matriarch of the Mercer Empire. She was a disposable contractor, a temporary employee hired to play the role of a mother, destined to be discarded the second the inheritance check cleared the bank. She buried her face in her hands. A single, ragged sob tore its way out of her throat. I let her cry. I sat perfectly still, listening to the condensation drip from the fern leaves above us. We were 2 women standing on completely different cliffs, staring down into the exact same abyss, realizing that the exact same man had cheerfully pushed us both toward the edge. "I do not forgive you for sleeping with my husband," I said quietly. cutting through her tears. I do not forgive you for stepping into my marriage or allowing Evelyn Mercer to treat you like a prized broodmare while treating me like a barren failure. Ava flinched, keeping her face hidden. But I know about Jude. I continued, my voice firm and absolute. I know he is your late sister's son. I know his father died in combat. Jude is an innocent orphan. He is a terrified 5-year-old boy who has been groomed to call a sociopath his father. I will not let a child be crushed under the wheels of the Mercer family's greed. Ava slowly lowered her hands. Her makeup was ruined, her eyes bloodshot and wide with a desperate, frantic terror. What do you want from me? She choked out. I want the rest of the ammunition, I replied. She stared at me for a long moment, the terrified 24-year-old girl slowly hardening into a fiercely protective guardian. If she had to choose between burning with Nolan or burning Nolan to the ground to save her nephew, the choice was primal and instantaneous. She reached into her purse and pulled out her smartphone. She unlocked the screen and slid it across the iron table toward me. He made me practice with Jude, Ava confessed, her voice thick with disgust. For weeks. He would sit in the townhouse living room and make Jude walk through the door and shout "Daddy" until it sounded perfectly natural. He coached me on exactly what to wear to the secret family dinners with Evelyn and Grant. He told me they were traditionalists who just needed to see a happy, traditional home. I scrolled through her phone. The audio files were a goldmine. I tapped on a locked folder titled Insurance. Those are the unedited school registration forms, Ava explained, wiping her eyes with the back of her sleeve. He made me use whiteout on the emergency contact lines and scan them back into the system so his name appeared as the primary guardian. And the audio files at the bottom are voicemails. I plugged a single wireless earpiece into my ear and tapped the most recent audio file. Nolan's voice filled my ear, clear and arrogant. Ava, honey, make sure Jude wears the navy blazer to dinner tonight. My mother loves that jacket. Just keep smiling and let me handle the talking. Once the old man finally flatlines and the trust administrators sign off, we will start quietly moving assets out of Wren's reach. My mother already has a holding company set up to dilute Wren's equity before I hand her the divorce papers. I pulled the earpiece out. Evelyn and Nolan were not just planning to leave me, they were actively conspiring to bankrupt me before they did. I forwarded every single file, every photograph, and every audio recording directly to Mara's secure server. I slid the phone back across the table. We have a mutual understanding, I said, locking my eyes with hers. From this exact second forward, you work for me. Ava nodded, her breath hitching. What do I do? You go back to the hospital, I instructed calmly. You sit by his bed, you hold his hand, and you act like the devoted, terrified secret weapon he believes you are. You smile at Evelyn. You let them believe their inheritance is just days away from arriving. You do not change a single detail of your routine. If you break character, if you give them even a microscopic hint that the trap has been sprung, I will not be able to shield your nephew from the federal fallout. Ava gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. And when it happens, when you finally tear them down, what happens to Jude? I picked up my teacup. When the explosion hits, I will personally detach the legal and financial protections of your nephew from the wreckage of Northline Aerial Systems. I will ensure the Mercer family cannot drag you into their fraud indictments. You will walk away with your sister's son, and you will never see any of them again. That is my one and only promise to you. Ava looked at me, a profound mixture of terror, awe, and desperate gratitude washing over her pale face. She stood up from the wrought iron table, her posture entirely different than when she had arrived. She was no longer a victim waiting for a payout. She was a silent assassin walking back into the enemy camp. I watched her walk out of the humid glass conservatory, disappearing into the bright afternoon sun. The alliance was forged in the dark, built on the absolute certainty of mutual destruction. I finished my bitter tea, the taste of complete, undeniable control sitting heavy and satisfying on my tongue. The mahogany doors of the Mercer family library clicked shut, sealing the five of us inside a room that smelled of aged leather, expensive bourbon, and desperate greed. Nolan was seated in a velvet wingback chair, his head still lightly bandaged, looking pale and thoroughly diminished. Evelyn and Grant stood near the marble fireplace, projecting an aura of inherited superiority that was beginning to fracture at the edges. Ava stood quietly behind Nolan, her hands resting protectively on his shoulders. And I stood at the head of the heavy oak table, commanding the geography of the room. I opened my leather briefcase and withdrew a stack of dense, intimidating legal folios. The financial bleeding at Northline Aerial Systems is entirely unsustainable, I announced, my voice echoing against the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The corporate lenders are in an absolute panic. The news of the accident, combined with the severe liquidity issues from the last 3 quarters, has triggered a default warning. Harrow Ridge Capital is threatening to recall their entire loan portfolio by Friday morning. If that happens, the company will be forced into involuntary bankruptcy before the weekend. Nolan gripped the armrests of his chair. Evelyn's posture stiffened, her eyes darting toward her husband. Grant cleared his throat, his aristocratic facade slipping. "There must be a contingency," Grant demanded, his voice tight. "Northline is the crown jewel of our active portfolio. We cannot simply let it collapse into receivership." I let a heavy, dramatic silence stretch across the room. I looked at each of them, projecting the image of a profoundly exhausted woman carrying the weight of their world on her shoulders. "I spent the last 48 hours negotiating a lifeline." I said quietly, "Harrow Ridge is willing to inject a massive rescue package to stabilize the balance sheets and restructure the debt. They are offering a bridge loan of exactly $50 million, but their terms are exceptionally draconian. They no longer trust the current executive structure." I slid the primary document across the polished oak table. "They are demanding 3 non-negotiable covenants," I explained, tracing the text with my manicured finger. "First, they require an absolute, sworn declaration of all related party transactions and internal cash flows. They want legal assurance that no corporate funds have been misused or diverted into unauthorized channels. Second, they require the Mercer Legacy Trust to pledge its upcoming voting rights as collateral against the new debt. And third, they are demanding the immediate appointment of an independent restructuring chair with absolute operational authority until the audit clears." Nolan looked up at me, his eyes wide with genuine panic. "An independent chair. They want to replace me. They wanted to bring in an external liquidator from New York." I lied flawlessly. "I fought them for 6 straight hours in a conference call this morning. I told them a stranger would tear the corporate culture apart. Finally, they agreed to a compromise. They will approve the $50 million package, but only if I assume the position of the restructuring chair." I sighed, rubbing my temples as if the mere thought of the responsibility was causing me physical pain. I told them I am already completely overloaded with my own firm in Charlotte. I do not want this job. "Nolan, it is a massive liability, but they trust my forensic track record. If I do not step in and take control of the ledger, they will pull the funding and shut the doors. I am only offering to do this to protect our family legacy." It was a perfectly constructed illusion. I was handing them a loaded gun and convincing them it was a life preserver. Grant leaned over the table, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. "We cannot pledge the voting rights of the trust," he argued, his voice dropping into a harsh whisper. "Harlan is entirely too fragile. If he passes away while the trust is leveraged to a corporate lender, the probate judge could freeze the entire transition." I watched Evelyn's mind work. She was calculating the brutal arithmetic of their massive fraud. If Northline Aerial Systems collapsed, the resulting financial scandal would invite a federal investigation into the entire family office. The shell company paying for the luxury townhouse would be exposed. The illusion of the golden heir would shatter before they could unlock Harlan's vault. She needed the company to survive, and she needed the lenders to look away. Evelyn stepped forward, placing a hand on her husband's arm. "We have to do it." "Grant," she said softly, her eyes flickering toward Ava, and then back to the legal documents. If the company falls, the collateral damage to the family reputation will be catastrophic. We must secure the future for the next generation. We must protect the boy's inheritance. Ava played her role with terrifying, Oscar-worthy precision. She leaned down, her cheek briefly brushing against Nolan's hair. "Wren is right," she whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured devotion. "You have built an incredible empire. Nolan, you cannot lose it now. We need to trust her. She is doing this for you. She is doing this for our future." The Mercer family was profoundly moved by the young secretary's blind loyalty. They had absolutely no idea she was actively helping me pour gasoline over their heads. Nolan reached for the heavy brass pen resting on the table. He looked at me, his eyes shining with a pathetic, deeply misguided gratitude. "Thank you. Wren," he murmured, "I know how much you are sacrificing for me." He signed the first page. Grant and Evelyn moved to his side, adding their signatures to the family trust collateral agreements. I stood perfectly still, watching the ink sink into the paper. The documents they were currently executing were not standard corporate rescue forms. They were sworn affidavits, drafted meticulously by my private legal team to be legally binding confessions of perjury and fraud. By signing the related party disclosure, Nolan was swearing under penalty of federal law that he had never diverted corporate funds for personal use, legally trapping himself in his own embezzlement. By signing the trust covenant, Evelyn and Grant were formally certifying that there were no fabricated heirs or fraudulent succession plans in motion, locking their conspiracy into the permanent court record. Every single stroke of their pen carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. While they were busy signing their lives away in the luxurious comfort of their private library, my personal wealth management attorney was walking into the county courthouse in downtown Charlotte. He was carrying a deeply confidential, ex parte emergency petition. He was filing the paperwork to legally sever my deceased father's ranch in Montana from any and all marital obligations, attaching the forensic handwriting analysis that definitively proved Nolan had forged my signature to steal $2.5 million in equity. I was surgically removing my assets from the blast radius. "Here, Wren," Nolan said, sliding the signed folios back across the polished oak. "It is all done. Whatever you need to do to satisfy the auditors, just do it quickly." I gathered the documents, aligning the edges with precise, methodical taps against the table. I placed them securely inside my leather briefcase and snapped the golden clasps shut. The sound echoed in the quiet room like the closing of a vault door. "I will handle the lenders immediately," I assured them, my tone soft and deeply comforting. "You have absolutely nothing left to worry about." A collective sigh of relief washed over the room. Evelyn smiled at me, a genuine, relaxed expression that I had not seen on her face in 8 years. Grant poured a small glass of bourbon, raising it in a silent, victorious toast to his son. They believed they had outsmarted the crisis. They believed I had surrendered to my role as the dutiful, hard-working wife who would clean up their messes while they quietly prepared to discard me. Ava caught my eye for a fraction of a second. The look exchanged between us was entirely imperceptible to the wealthy, arrogant fools celebrating around us. It was a look of absolute, cold-blooded solidarity. I walked out of the Mercer estate and stepped into the cool afternoon air. I slid into the back seat of my waiting town car and placed the briefcase on the leather seat beside me. The trap was fully constructed, baited, and locked. The only thing left to do was wait for the old man to finally stop breathing and watch the entire Mercer dynasty step off the ledge. 2 weeks passed. Nolan returned to the executive suite of Northline Aerial Systems, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that cost over $4,000. His mild concussion had faded, leaving only a faint pink scar near his hairline. He walked through the glass atrium with a wide, arrogant stride, projecting the image of a man who had conquered a severe crisis through sheer brilliance. In his mind, he was the absolute center of the chessboard. He believed the massive bridge loan from the lenders was secured. He believed his parents were entirely aligned with his fraudulent succession plan, and he believed I was firmly under his control, dutifully keeping the corporate wolves at bay. He decided it was time to initiate the final phase of his extraction. He booked a secluded table at a high-end French restaurant on a Thursday evening. The dining room was dimly lit, smelling of roasted duck and heavily bruised truffles. He ordered a bottle of vintage Bordeaux that cost $1,200, pouring me a glass with a practiced, solemn grace. He waited until the waiter cleared our appetizers before he leaned across the white linen tablecloth, adopting the tone of a benevolent executive offering a generous severance package. "Ren, we need to be realistic about our future," he began smoothly, swirling the dark red liquid in his crystal glass. "This accident, it really forced me to evaluate my life. Our marriage has been over for a very long time. We both know it. We are practically just roommates who share a corporate portfolio." I took a slow sip of my water, my face a perfect, unreadable mask. "Go on," I prompted quietly. He offered me a civilized divorce. He spoke of avoiding messy litigation and public spectacles. His terms were staggeringly insulting. He proposed that I keep the downtown condominium, a space barely 2,000 square feet, along with my personal vehicle and a one-time cash buyout of exactly $500,000. It was a microscopic fraction of his actual net worth. "I am building a new life. Ren," he continued, mistaking my silence for submission, "Jude needs a real, stable home. And Ava is ready to step up and be the partner I actually need. Once my grandfather passes and the family estate settles, I want to make a clean break. If you sign a quiet separation agreement now, I will ensure you are taken care of. If you fight me, the legal fees will eat you alive." Any normal woman would have thrown the $1,200 wine directly into his arrogant face. She would have screamed, shattered the crystal, and caused a magnificent scene. I did absolutely nothing of the sort. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I simply looked at him. I looked at him the exact same way a senior forensic auditor looks at a junior accountant who has just egregiously miscalculated a massive balance sheet and confidently presented it as a masterpiece. He was sitting there, boldly dictating the terms of my surrender, completely oblivious to the fact that he was already financially and legally dead. "That is certainly a proposal." "Nolan," I replied softly, placing my napkin on the table, "I will take it under advisement." I left him sitting there with the bill. While Nolan was playing the benevolent dictator to my face, he and Evelyn were actively working to slit my throat in the dark. Utilizing my temporary position as the restructuring chair, I had full access to the internal corporate communications. I watched their smear campaign unfold in real time. Evelyn began hosting quiet, exclusive luncheons with the wives of the board directors. Nolan held private golf outings with the senior stakeholders. Together, they planted toxic, deeply misogynistic seeds of doubt regarding my mental stability. They weaponized my deepest personal trauma. They whispered that I had become dangerously unhinged after 3 consecutive rounds of failed in vitro fertilization. They painted me as a tragic, hysterical, bitter woman whose grief had morphed into a pathological obsession with controlling her husband's company. They argued that my aggressive restructuring tactics were not business strategies, but rather the erratic flailing of a woman having a nervous breakdown. They were setting the stage to invalidate my authority and vote me out the exact second the trust money cleared. I had anticipated this exact maneuver. I did not defend myself to the board. I simply let them dig the hole deeper. While I meticulously gathered the dirt they were throwing, I compiled the digital access logs from the hospital on the day of the crash. The logs explicitly showed Evelyn bypassing standard protocol at 3:45 in the afternoon, heavily tipping a triage nurse to physically bar me from the trauma ward. I collected the internal text messages between Nolan and his mother, where they actively fabricated the tragic narrative of the secret wife and child to gaslight me into submission. They were documenting their own psychological abuse. Ava, honoring our dangerous underground alliance, delivered the most lethal piece of ammunition. We met in the shadowy corner of an underground parking garage on a Tuesday at noon. She handed me a small, encrypted thumb drive. It contained a high-definition audio recording she had captured on her cellular phone the night before. I plugged the drive into my secure laptop later that evening. Nolan's voice filled my office, slurred slightly by expensive scotch. He was bragging to Ava in the living room of the Dilworth townhouse. "The second the old man is in the ground and the legacy trust unlocks, I am transferring the controlling shares into a blind holding company." Nolan boasted on the recording. "We will bleed Northline dry and push Wren out completely. The board already thinks she is crazy and emotionally unstable. We just let her have a public meltdown, and it will finalize the divorce entirely on my terms. She will walk away with absolutely nothing." It was premeditated, malicious financial sabotage. The final nail in his corporate coffin came from an unexpected source. The chief accountant of Northline Aerial Systems, a quiet, meticulously organized man who had spent 20 years balancing the firm's ledgers, walked into my office late on a Friday afternoon. He had watched my aggressive audit protocols and realized the ship was rapidly sinking. He decided to secure his own immunity by handing me the captain. He slid a heavy bound ledger across my desk. It contained the unredacted expense reports for the last 18 months. Nolan had not just paid for Ava's townhouse and Jude's school tuition. The ledger provided definitive proof that Nolan had expensed luxury vacations to the Caribbean, designer diamond jewelry, and the retainer fees for the discount estate lawyers. He had instructed the accounting department to camouflage every single one of these personal expenditures as international market development costs and corporate research overhead. It was systematic, undeniable corporate tax fraud. Nolan believed he had successfully arranged every single piece on the board. He believed his smear campaign was working, his divorce trap was set, and his golden heir was ready to inherit the earth. He was eagerly waiting for the starting gun to fire. The universe obliged him. On a rainy Monday morning at exactly 6:15, the news broke. Harlan Mercer, the 92-year-old patriarch of the Mercer dynasty, finally succumbed to massive organ failure in his private hospice suite. The sprawling Mercer empire was officially without a king, within 4 hours of his passing. The senior partners at Vance and Sterling Estate Law filed the emergency paperwork with the county probate court. The official confirmation hearing to unseal the Mercer Legacy Trust and legally validate the heir was scheduled for the following Thursday at 10 o'clock in the morning. The waiting was over. The suffocating tension broke. The entire Mercer family immediately dropped their masks and lunged toward the massive vault of wealth, completely unaware that I had already wired the entire room with high explosives. The day of reckoning had finally arrived. The entire Mercer family immediately decamped to their sprawling historic estate in Charleston. The probate hearing for the Mercer Legacy Trust was scheduled to take place at the county courthouse on a Thursday morning. The stakes were absolute. If they succeeded in legally validating the boy as the biological heir, Nolan would instantly regain total control over Northline Aerial Systems. Ava would be elevated to the untouchable status of a billionaire's consort, and I would be unceremoniously discarded. I would be permanently branded as the bitter, unstable ex-wife who could not provide the dynasty with a child. I did absolutely nothing to disrupt their premature victory lap. I did not release a public statement. I did not grant angry interviews. Instead, I gave them enough space to ruin themselves on a massive, highly visible public stage. Evelyn hired a boutique public relations firm to leak carefully curated, sickeningly sweet stories to the local Carolina press. Suddenly, my husband was the subject of glowing profile pieces about a man who survived a horrific automobile crash only to realize the true meaning of family. Glossy, high-resolution photographs of Nolan, Ava, and little Jude walking hand in hand down cobblestone streets flooded the digital society pages. They painted a flawless portrait of a devoted father finding redemption. The articles never mentioned my name. I watched the media spin from my office in Charlotte, entirely unfazed. The higher they built their pedestal of lies, the more bones they would break when the foundation finally shattered. Nolan's arrogance rapidly mutated into a breathtaking, calculated cruelty. On the Tuesday afternoon before the hearing, He marched into my executive office at Sterling Vale Advisory. He bypassed my assistant, slamming the heavy glass door shut behind him. He dropped a thick, freshly printed divorce decree directly onto my desk. The new terms were even more insulting than his previous offer. He leaned over my desk, his designer cologne suffocating the air in my office. His face was a mask of cold malice. He told me that if I did not sign the separation papers before the judge's gavel fell in Charleston, he would authorize his aggressive legal team to publicly release my deeply private medical records. He threatened to expose every single failed round of in vitro fertilization, every agonizing hormone treatment, and every psychological evaluation I had endured over the last 3 years. He wanted to humiliate me on a corporate level, to prove to the board of directors that my ruthless restructuring tactics were nothing more than the frantic, hysterical coping mechanisms of a broken, barren woman. I looked at the thick stack of legal threats, and then I looked up into his smug, victorious eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not reach for my expensive fountain pen. I simply slid the heavy stack of paper back across the polished mahogany surface. "I will see you in court." "Nolan," I said quietly. My voice was completely devoid of friction. He sneered, adjusting his silk tie, completely convinced that my refusal was just the last gasp of a defeated woman. He turned and walked out of my office, entirely unaware that he had just handed me the final justification to utterly destroy him. While Nolan was busy choosing his tailored suit for his grand coronation, I was quietly dismantling the structural integrity of his entire kingdom. That same afternoon, my elite legal team filed 3 heavily sealed, highly classified dossiers directly with the Charleston probate judge. The first dossier contained the official forensic handwriting analysis, definitively proving my signature was forged on the multi-million-dollar property mortgage, backed by banking records showing the illegal transfer of my private equity. The second dossier was an emergency injunction to immediately freeze any and all capital distributions from the Mercer Legacy Trust, pending a sweeping federal fraud investigation. And the third dossier was the most lethal weapon in my entire arsenal. It was a 20-page sworn affidavit of full cooperation, signed and legally notarized by Ava Bell. It detailed every single lie, every rehearsed family dinner, and every piece of falsified documentation. The suffocating pressure on the Mercer family was further intensified by a ticking clock they could not control. Harrow Ridge Capital, the primary corporate lender, issued a formal, legally binding notice. The final $50 million rescue package for Northline Aerial Systems would officially close at exactly 2 o'clock on the afternoon of the hearing. The critical funding was strictly contingent upon a clean, completely fraud-free transition of the estate. If the trust unlocked smoothly, the company survived. If there was even a microscopic whisper of legal irregularity, the lenders would instantly pull the capital, triggering a catastrophic default and immediate asset seizure. The Mercers were racing toward the finish line, terrified and desperate to keep their pristine facade intact for just 48 more hours. On Wednesday night, the eve of the hearing, the Mercer family celebrated early. Through the private investigator I had hired to monitor their movements, I received a detailed report. They had rented out the entire private dining room of a 5-star seafood restaurant in downtown Charleston. Nolan, Evelyn, and Grant toasted with vintage champagne that cost thousands of dollars per bottle. They were completely blindly certain that Ava would continue to play her role as the dutiful, silent mother. They believed I was trapped, completely outmaneuvered by their public relations campaign, and preparing to accept a humiliating, quiet defeat. They went to sleep that night dreaming of a golden empire, their heads resting on pillows stuffed with arrogance. Thursday morning broke with a heavy, oppressive humidity that tasted like impending doom. The historic county courthouse was a magnificent, imposing structure of white marble and dark mahogany. The air inside was cool and sterile. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy double doors of the probate courtroom swung open. Nolan walked in first, flanked by Evelyn and Grant. They moved with the synchronized, entitled grace of royalty arriving to claim their rightful throne. Nolan wore a pristine navy pinstripe suit, his head held high. He scanned the wooden gallery pews, expecting to see his beautifully dressed secret family waiting patiently to be presented to the judge. But the gallery was completely empty. Nolan frowned, his confident stride faltering slightly. He turned his gaze toward the front of the room, looking past the heavy wooden railing that separated the spectators from the legal proceedings. I was already seated at the polished oak table reserved for the opposing counsel. I wore a sharp, unforgiving black suit. My posture was perfectly straight, my hands folded neatly over my leather briefcase. And then, the first, devastating shockwave hit him. Ava Bell was not waiting in the corridor. She was not sitting in the gallery with the little boy. Ava was sitting directly beside my lead attorney, firmly entrenched behind my legal table. She wore a simple, unadorned gray dress. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, and her eyes were fixed firmly on the judge's empty wooden bench. She did not look at Nolan. She did not look at Evelyn. She radiated the terrifying, untouchable calm of a witness who had already surrendered her soul to the prosecution. Nolan stopped dead in his tracks. The color violently drained from his face, leaving his skin the shade of old parchment. Evelyn gasped, her manicured hand flying to her throat as if she had suddenly been deprived of oxygen. Grant stumbled forward a half step, his aristocratic composure shattering into a million pieces of raw, unfiltered panic. They stared at the young secretary sitting on the wrong side of the battlefield. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind them, sealing them inside the room. There was no escape. The brilliant, invincible trap had finally snapped shut, and they were standing directly in the center of the steel teeth. The heavy oak doors of the Charleston probate courtroom remained sealed, trapping the stale air and the mounting tension inside. The judge, a stern man with silver hair and zero tolerance for theatricality, called the chamber to order at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. Nolan's lead attorney, a high-priced litigator from a prestigious coastal firm, stood up and smoothed the lapels of his tailored suit. Despite the visible, vibrating panic radiating from the Mercer family at the sight of Ava sitting firmly behind my legal table, the lawyer had no choice but to execute the strategy he had been handsomely paid to deliver. He launched into a profoundly moving, entirely fabricated narrative designed to manipulate the court's sympathies. He spoke of Nolan's recent brush with death in the automobile collision, spinning the traumatic event as a profound moral awakening. He painted my husband as a man who had finally realized the true, lasting priorities of family and legacy over corporate ambition. Then, with a sweeping, dramatic gesture toward the empty gallery where he assumed the boy would be sitting, he formally presented the core claim. He stated that Jude was the biological son of Nolan Mercer, the product of a quiet, long-standing relationship, and the sole eligible male heir required to unlock the multi-million-dollar Mercer Legacy Trust before it defaulted to charity. The lawyer concluded his opening statement with a deeply solemn nod toward Nolan, presenting him as a devoted patriarch ready to shepherd the family fortune into the next century. The judge turned his imposing gaze to my table. I did not say a single word. I simply nodded to my lead counsel, who stood up and placed a massive, heavy leather binder directly onto the judge's elevated bench. "Your Honor," my attorney began, his voice ringing with absolute, lethal clarity, "we contest the claim of paternity. In fact, we contest the entire foundational premise of this hearing. The child in question is not a Mercer. He has absolutely no genetic tie to that family." I stood up and began dealing the evidentiary documents across the polished wooden table, like a casino dealer handing out a spectacularly losing hand. I laid down the certified county guardianship decree, definitively proving Jude was the biological nephew of Ava, born to her late sister. Next came the military death certificate of the boy's actual father. Then, I displayed the heavily redacted school registration forms and the pediatric hospital records, placing the original, unaltered documents directly beside the falsified versions Nolan had deliberately submitted to the trust administrators. The courtroom was suffocatingly silent. The judge flipped through the thick binder, his expression darkening into a mask of pure judicial outrage with every turned page. Then, Ava stood up. She did not look at Nolan. She looked directly at the judge and spoke under penalty of perjury. She confessed absolutely everything. She detailed, with painful clarity, how Nolan had explicitly coached a traumatized 5-year-old boy to call him daddy in the living room of their rented townhouse. She testified about the meticulously rehearsed family dinners, the hollow promises of legal adoption once the grandfather died, and the explicit documented understanding that she and her nephew were nothing more than a biological lockpick designed to bypass the strict estate clauses. Nolan gripped the edge of his mahogany table, his knuckles turning bone white. Evelyn buried her face in her trembling hands, a low, guttural gasp escaping her throat as her social empire evaporated. Grant sat entirely paralyzed, staring blankly at the wall, but I was not finished. A meticulously executed demolition requires a secondary explosion to level the foundation completely and ensure nothing can ever be rebuilt. Before the Mercer legal team could even attempt to object or frantically call for a brief recess, I signaled my attorney to present the second, even heavier dossier. This hearing is no longer just a matter of contested paternity and a failed inheritance, I stated, my voice echoing off the cold marble walls. It is a matter of systemic, multi-million-dollar financial fraud. I submitted the forensic handwriting analysis proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that Nolan had forged my signature on the commercial mortgage against my late father's Montana ranch. I provided the exhaustive banking ledgers tracking the stolen $2.5 million as it washed through the Mercer family office shell company to secretly pay for Ava's luxury townhouse and the boys' private tuition. And finally, I presented the absolute crown jewels of my trap. I handed over the sworn, legally notarized affidavits Nolan, Evelyn, and Grant had so eagerly signed in their private library just days prior to secure the corporate loan. The documents where they explicitly swore, under threat of federal prosecution, that no corporate funds had been diverted and no fraudulent succession plans existed. The representative from Harrow Ridge Capital, sitting quietly in the back row of the gallery to monitor their investment, immediately stood up and walked briskly out of the courtroom. The terms of the $50 million rescue package demanded absolute honesty and clean collateral. By perjuring themselves on those documents, the Mercers had triggered an automatic, catastrophic default covenant. Within minutes, the lenders would freeze every single corporate account, seize the real estate, and begin liquidating Northline Aerial Systems assets. The judge slammed his wooden gavel down with the deafening force of a thunderclap. He officially denied the petition to recognize Jude as a legitimate heir. He ordered an immediate, indefinite freeze on the entire Mercer Legacy Trust, locking the fortune away forever. And, as his furious eyes swept over the ashen, destroyed faces of my husband and my in-laws, he formally recommended the entire case file be transferred to the federal authorities for criminal investigation regarding felony forgery, estate fraud, and corporate embezzlement. The Mercer dynasty died in that courtroom exactly at 11:45 in the morning. The afternoon brought absolutely no mercy. I returned to Charlotte and convened an emergency mandatory session of the Northline Aerial Systems Board of Directors. Armed with the fully unlocked evidence of his luxury Caribbean vacations, designer diamond jewelry, and hidden legal fees, all fraudulently disguised as international market development costs, the board's vote was unanimous and brutal. Nolan was permanently stripped of his chief executive title, removed from the board entirely, and escorted out of the glass building by armed corporate security. Evelyn and Grant were formally removed from all advisory committees, their generational influence completely eradicated. As the company plummeted rapidly into receivership under the crushing weight of the frozen credit lines, I executed my final, flawless financial maneuver. Through a clean, newly established holding company entirely under my sole operational control, I purchased the uncontaminated core software architecture of Northline for pennies on the dollar straight out of the wreckage. I took the only genuinely valuable asset he had ever built and made it legally mine. I kept my promise to the young secretary. I did not let the innocent child fall into the abyss with them. I instructed my legal team to aggressively petition the court to establish a specialized, strictly monitored educational trust for Jude. It was funded exclusively by liquidating the illegal gifts and the townhouse lease the Mercers had funneled through the shell company. The boy would have his school tuition paid and a safe, modest place to live until he turned 18. He was completely protected, but he would never again be used as a desperate pawn for the Mercer family. Ava packed her belongings that exact same evening. She left Charlotte with Jude, driving out of the city limits as his legally recognized guardian. She stepped out of the intoxicating shadow of a fake billionaire lifestyle and back into the harsh light of reality. She no longer harbored any delusions of grand, sweeping romance. She carried only the heavy, deeply painful wisdom of a woman who had nearly sold her entire existence for a breathtaking promise that was entirely hollow. The next morning, the sun broke over the Charlotte skyline, casting a brilliant, blinding light across the awakening city. I stood completely alone on the expansive rooftop terrace of my newly acquired corporate headquarters. The air was crisp and freezing. I did not shed a single tear of grief for my broken marriage. I did not smile in gloating, victorious triumph. I simply breathed in the cold morning air, feeling the immense, quiet satisfaction of absolute, unquestionable control settling into my bones. I finally understood the profound truth of my survival. The perfect revenge was never about screaming in a crowded hospital hallway or staging a hysterical, tear-filled confrontation. It was about possessing the sheer, terrifying discipline to remain completely calm, to politely hand your enemies a pen, and to stand back in silence while they eagerly signed their own death warrants. Thank you so much for listening to this story today, and please leave a comment down below telling us where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. I invite you to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us further by hitting the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.